Greetings. I'm Dr.Aldrich, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. My next guest is Dr. Pat Ogden. She is the creator of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy method and founder of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. Dr. Ogden is trained in a wide variety of somatic and psychotherapeutic approaches and has over 45 years of experience. She is co-founder of the Hakomi Institute, past faculty of Naropa University, a clinician, consultant, and highly sought-after international lecturer. Dr. Ogden is the first author of two groundbreaking books in somatic psychology, Trauma and the Body, A Sensorimotor Approach to Psychotherapy, and Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment. In today's discussion, we talk about why humans have become disconnected from their bodies and why it's becoming, again, of mainstream importance. We dive into the body and ways of experiencing it from the inside out. Dr. Ogden then discusses cases, elucidating how our bodies express our life stories and how therapy may engage the body to change our internal narratives for the better. We touch on trauma, body image, and dissociative challenges. We complete the dialogue by touching on specific interventions from sensorimotor therapy, and finally end with a round of rapid-fire questions. I guess I wanted to actually start us off with a bit of a more of a philosophical question. And, the importance of the body has been spoken of in many different time periods and cultures, all the way back in, 3,000 years ago in Taoist work. And if we go all the way to Nietzsche and other people in our field like Wilhelm Reich and Fritz Perls, and one of your major influences, Ron Kurtz, or Francisco Varela, Levine, Lanius to Bessel to yourself, it's just crazy to me to think that it's only more recently that the body has become more cherished and of more value in the domain of therapy. And it's interesting to consider the question why that is. And I think this sort of positively reflects a transitional phase where we're sort of climbing through this, or climbing out of the philosophical dualism that was left over by Plato and Descartes and other belief systems that separated mind and body. And I think part of the issue is that discord, right, can grow when these ideologies can impose the idea that all negative things are coming from the body and all the positive things are in the mind or the soul. And I guess I wanted to start off by asking you, what are your thoughts on that? And why do you think it is that sort of it's now that our bodies are becoming so much more important?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think the body has been important, but it hasn't really taken off. Like Pierre Genet in the 1800s and early 1900s, he wrote extensively about the importance of the body in working with the traumatized patients he was treating.
Mm.
But it didn't hit the mainstream. It didn't really take off. I think people have a real love-hate relationship with the body. I think in the Western world, the body is really denied. I remember one client told me that she was taught that the body was fodder for the devil. And
Mm.
that was pretty, I mean, that's an extreme statement, but still what you said, like the body is the root of sin and, you
Mm-hmm.
know, sex drives that are to be, held back. And I think also marginalized people have experienced terrible uh, misattributions in terms of their bodies, like the Black body should be controlled, they're out of control, they're over-sexualized, and so
Mm.
forth. So there are a lot of stereotypes that are kind of in the field, in just the energy field still. And I think body therapy it's had a checkered past. I mean,
Mm.
let's be we can be honest about that.
Yeah.
So when that happens, and there's a lot of controls that come. When I first showed Bessel a videotape, I think it was 1994. I use a lot of touch in my work,
Mm.
and I had a lot of training in use of touch and so forth. And Russell said, he said, I love your work, but he said, you can't show touch because if you do, your work will never get accepted.
Right.
So
Yeah.
take all the touch out. And that wasn't that long ago. That was
Mm.
like 30, well, it was 30 years ago now. I guess that was a while ago. Um, but I think that attitude that the body is going to lead you down the wrong road to sin, and I think that's really pretty still prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's get into it a little bit more now. Sensorimotor psychotherapy, and the institute that you founded was all the way back in 1981, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's a nice place for us to start off is to really explore the body as a valuable source of information. And now, so in the name of it, sensory, there's the sensory component, there's also the motor component. And perhaps we can first start off by touching on the various sensory experiences to sort of familiarize people with the terrain. I think the most obvious, of course, is that there are five senses, right? Sight, taste, smell, hearing, touch. People are very aware of this. But what is less known is this idea of interoception, right? The ability to feel within.
Mhm.
And there are many contributors that you write about in regards to interoception, things like the proprioceptors, interoception, nociception, thermoception, and even the vestibular system. And I was wondering if you could touch on a few of these and maybe talk a little bit about why they might be important to be aware of.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, in terms of therapy, the ability to sense your body in space with proprioception, the ability to tune into your inner body sensation and let that implicitly or explicitly guide your actions.
Mm,
I think it's really critical, especially with traumatized people. There's a super big disconnection from the body. Like I have clients who they don't even feel their sensation. They'll touch their bodies. They can't even feel the touch. So there's that dissociation from the body in trauma. So helping people be able to tune into their body sensation. Um, and also, when you can do that, you can allow the body to complete the actions and the arousal in a way that I don't know. It doesn't. That can't happen just through talking therapy.
mm,
So a big part of sensorimotor psychotherapy is helping people sense their body in space, sense their movement, feel inside to all the different sensations, and it's like opening up a whole new world for
hmm
people. Um, in our work, we have a whole like a handout that I'll give clients about words that describe your body sensation because they're really different from what describes emotion,
mm,
thought, and to help people reattune to their bodies in that way. It's a big part of healing, especially with trauma, but even with just with neurosis and non traumatized clients.
hmm Yeah, it's interesting how much of a benefit people can derive from, as you mentioned, bringing in this entire new dimension of experience that they've already sort of had, but they didn't perhaps have the words to label or the awareness of because they're so focused out there and not really within their body that, when you bring them to that landscape, it can really enrich their lives in many different ways.
Mhm.
Um, another thing I think is kind of interesting to note in basic neuroanatomy, right? We know that the premotor and the motor cortex that they lie in the frontal lobe, right? And then the sensory homunculus is, of course, in the parietal lobe. But it's interesting to note that these motor regions are strategically located in the frontal lobe because much planning and organization is required to the deployment, we could say, of sequences of actions. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between movement and executive functions.
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist. I work with people. I'm not. I don't really know the workings on the brain, so I can't really speak, authoritatively from that perspective. In terms of the brain, I haven't studied neuroscience. I mean, I just kind of graze the surface of that realm.
Ah, okay.
Um, but what I will say is that from a psychotherapeutic point of view, as trauma patients especially, they're often controlled really by the subcortical impulses, the instinctive defensive responses
Hmm.
that can really get out of control. And those are accompanied by what Piaget used to call vehement emotions that fuel those defenses, like rage will fuel a fight response. So, from a therapeutic standpoint, keeping the executive functioning online to observe and help those responses sequence through and complete is really essential.
Hmm.
Because if not, new therapy is going to re-traumatize people. And that's what happened in the 60s. People were, at least in my world, not in Dan's world. Dan and I have talked about our different backgrounds. Dan came much more from a cognitive background. I came much more from a bodywork, alternative perspective. And
Hmm.
we were, back in the 60s, we were encouraging patients to just express those emotions. But when they're related to trauma and the emotions that really drive those instinctive defenses, like terror and panic and rage, the expression doesn't help them resolve. And Piaget knew this. He wrote back in, I think it's either 1907 or 1925, one of his books, that you can't go into those emotions because they will not complete.
Hmm.
They just they might you might experience a catharsis, but it won't have any lasting effect.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, he had that wonderful quote that patients affected by traumatic memory have not been able to perform any kind of the actions characteristic of the stage of triumph, right?
Yeah, yeah, I
And
love that. Yeah.
yeah, that's a wonderful one that I think relates to what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and when you think about that, Janae would talk about mental and physical actions. You get stuck mentally in things like "I'm damaged," "It's all my fault," etc. But
Mm.
in terms of the body, Janae would say, the actions that started when the thing happened have never had a chance to complete.
Mm.
And that's where we really get into I think, the subcortical instinctive actions. So in a body therapy approach, we want those to come up from the body, not from the mind, because we want them to really resolve on that bodily level,
Mm.
uh, not from a cognitive uh,
Right.
place. So it's really critical, I think, in trauma, because trauma affects the body first
Mhm.
before we can before the information goes to our thinking brain.
Mm.
So we really want to resolve the effects of trauma on that level, in,
Okay.
in my perspective.
Yeah. So let's. I'd like to dive a little deeper into that. If that's okay with you. The idea that there is a somatic narrative, right? This a story told by our bodies that reflects our history, which,
Uh-huh.
as you mentioned and have amplified, tends to be implicit or non-conscious, is a basic premise in somatic-based therapies, and this can be expressed through our posture, gesture, eye gaze, and facial expressions, and the whole host of nonverbal expressions that we humans use to communicate. Could you share an example or two that clearly demonstrates how our body's beliefs and emotions can sort of come hand in hand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can. There's This is kind of the basic premise of sensory psychotherapy,
Mm.
and it goes both ways. Like as we as our bodies grow, the way I think of it is that there's all this um, information coming in, from our attachment figures, from society, from the sociocultural context, and
Mhm.
all of that has an impact on the body as if it were a physical force, right? So if you get a message, like I'm thinking of a client of I shouldn't kill myself, it's not safe. If you get that either from the culture or from your family, your parents, that it's going to start to impact the body, and it's going to, as if it were a physical force, and the body's going to respond to that, maybe by shrinking,
Mm.
maybe by collapsing, um, you know, and when that happens, like I do this often when I'm teaching. Like if people, first it comes in from the outside, but then when your body takes it on, like even if I do this posture,
Mm,
of hunched shoulders, and I start to feel uncomfortable. I even start to feel a little bit fearful.
mm,
So there's this feedback loop, um, and it's research has really been showing that now. Like there there's research by some Norwegians years and years ago. Dijkstra, I think, was the lead researcher, and they show that if you take on a certain posture, like a posture like this or like this, that the memories of when that posture was operationalized will start to come forward. And so you just think how significant that is for clients. Like if a client has a posture like this, implicitly, the memories are going to start to surface of
mhm.
when they were in a situation where they had to shrink away. Um, so I really don't even understand how people can only work with the mind and not work with shifts in the body.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. People traditionally, of course, they sort of think of the fact that there are these emotions, there are thoughts, and their behaviors, and each one of these influences each other. But you're adding this whole dimension of the body there as
Yeah,
well. It's like, don't forget the body, right? And
right. Well, the body is you can't escape it. I mean, this is where everything happens in this
right,
lifetime.
yeah,
Everything occurs through our bodies, and Reich would say the body's the manifestation of the unconscious.
mm,
So if you're going to work with the implicit, and the non-conscious, Alan Shore would say, well, that's right brain that governs most of our lives. I
hmm,
don't know any better route than to go to the body
right, right.
because it will reveal, as Ron said. Ron Kurtz, that was his first book, The Body Reveals, and it does. You know,
Hmm. So speaking of the unconscious, there's some interesting estimates that are being thrown out there now that's like 90 to 99.8% of activity is unconscious, and in the brain, this is related to, as you mentioned, preferential activation of subcortical activity. These are reflexive responses, perhaps more sensory and emotionally driven expressions. Now, growing research also supports this idea that early childhood experiences are going to interact with our biology and create a foundation, right, for how we relate to others as adults. And I'm, of course, pointing towards attachment now.
yeah.
And could you elaborate on some of your thoughts relating to attachment in relationship to the body? What are some common somatic indicators connected to, you know, attachment related issues that you've noticed?
Okay. Well, Ed Tronick and Beatrice Fifi, who are both infant researchers, they're on our advisory board, and so I've worked a lot with them, and I love watching the videos of
Mm,
babies, like pre-verbal, people, and you will see especially their proximity-seeking actions with Bowlby. John Bowlby taught us about. These proximity seeking actions don't have to be taught. Like, you don't have to teach a baby how to reach out, to the caregiver, or how to seek proximity, or, reach up to be held.
mm,
They don't have to learn that really. Um, but you will see in the infant research and the videos that Ed and Beatrice show how those proximity seeking actions start to be modified by the way the attachment figures interact with them, you know. And then you see that in adults as well. Like one of my favorite experiments with clients is just to ask them to reach out, like without thinking about it, just reach out with your arms.
mm,
And people they reach out. They might reach out like this, or one guy reached out with his arm down like this. So why don't I reach out? He said, "No, you're there for me." I mean, it shows.
yeah.
One client said, "Well, I'd like to reach out." She was like in her almost 40, and her shoulders hunched and her hands reached, but
Mm,
the body had two different actions.
mhm,
One was afraid, and the other wanted to seek proximity. So Beatrice said um, you can track these movement sequences in infants, and their habits of movement. And it does, like you said, it sets a trajectory for future development. Of course, it's changed by experience, but if you have that experience through your childhood in some ongoing way where your attachment figures, if you reach out, they're not going to be there for you in the way that you need. They're not going to respond in the way you need. You're going to modify that action in
Hmm.
some. You're going to reach halfway, or you're going to reach and pull back, or and that's often at the root of people's relational problems.
Hmm.
So it's so interesting to be able to see these actions in infants. And Bonnie Brainbridge Cohen would say you even see those in the womb. She defines 5 movements that you see in the womb: a yield, which is just a kind of a letting go, a push with the head, push with the feet. We think about pushing with the arms,
Right.
a reach, a grasp, a holding on, and a pull. And all you see all those movements, even in the womb.
Mm-hmm.
But she thinks those are 5 basic, neurological movements. But all those movements are adapted and modified depending on the context, And it's not just attachment; it's also cultural. Like I'm thinking of one client who she had a posture that was pulled in, like this, and I mean, I'm thinking attachment. I'm thinking, okay, I wonder what that interaction was that caused her body to pull in. And we explored it. And she was Asian American. And she said, "What? This is from my culture." She said, "I never felt safe in the world." And, I pulled in. So we have to also contextualize, these movements and put them in a socio cultural context as well. It's not
Hmm.
all about attachment.
Hmm.
So, isn't it fascinating? It's so
Yeah,
interesting.
it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I mean, the body is essentially an index of different aspects of the mind, much of which
Yeah,
are, unconscious. And these different positions that you're showing us now, it's sort of demonstrating how an incompatible experience can be manifested in the expression of the body, which really is fascinating. Hmm.
yeah, yeah. And I think what people don't um, realize is that feedback loop. It's not just that the body's a reflection of the mind; it also sustains our beliefs. Like if we have a belief like, I got to fight for everything I get. The body's going to be mobilized like this, and when the body is mobilized, it brings up that, I mean, I can feel it even just doing this. I feel more assertive, maybe a little, even I could get into being a little aggressive if I keep posture. So
Hmm.
there's this back and forthness that happens between the mind and the body.
Yeah, the body is not disconnected from the mind, but in fact it plays a very important role and is connected in more ways than people might imagine.
It is.
Mm.
An Alexander teacher, Barlow, he said, the body, the shape and the movement of the body is a position from which certain thoughts and feelings are possible.
Mm.
And when you think about that, I think that's such a great statement.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. That's definitely food for thought. I'll have to
Yeah.
chew on that one for a bit. So I wanted to. So in some of your writing, you also. I'm going to go back a little bit to attachment and psychodynamic therapy because those are well, important incorporations to your work in sensorimotor psychotherapy. But there are differences, and one of the differences that you've noted is the importance of steering away from interpretation, let's say, and observing and alerting and reorienting their attention to the particular nonverbals that may be significant, right? Are there other ways where traditional psychodynamic approach does not necessarily align when it comes to techniques or anything else?
Well, I was never trained psychodynamically.
Right.
I don't want to really speak to psychodynamic work because I haven't been trained.
Oh.
What I've learned from all the students is that it's conversation you're talking about.
Mm.
And a huge difference between just that approach of talking about and the way we work that I learned from Ron Kurtz in the 1970s was about the importance of getting underneath the conversation to how we organize our experience.
Hmm.
Because we're just talking, we're talking through our MO, we're talking through our beliefs, and we're just having a conversation.
Hmm.
It's like that a statement, you can't take the engine apart when it's running.
Mm.
You can't really study the organization of experience and learn about it if you're just talking, if you're just in it.
Hmm.
So this is a marked difference, I think, from psychodynamic or any kind of talk therapy, is that the emphasis is not on talking in sensorimotor psychotherapy. It's on the organization of experience. Like, if you think of that, if a client comes in and says, I want to work on this, when I was raped, when I was, 10 years old, like huge traumatic memory. I'm not really even interested in hearing about the incident, except that the client might need to tell me, so we build a relationship that way. What I'm interested in and what I would ask is like, okay, what happens right now when you remember that rape?
Hmm.
Like, what happens in your body? Does your body tighten up? Does it collapse? Does it move forward? What happens in your thought? Because this is where the beliefs are, it's all my fault. This was my fault. I shouldn't have been there in that room with that guy. What happens in your emotions? So that's the organization of experience.
Mm.
Ron would say that it's the leftovers in a way. Those are
Mm.
the things that haven't resolved, that are still, really determining the quality of your life.
Hmm.
So it's not the event, it's how we organize that event
Right.
into meaning and, thinking and bodily movement and gesture. You
Hmm.
know, gesture. That's what's really essential. And that changes everything. And that's the hardest thing for students to get, because you're not having a conversation anymore. And you're not talking, but you're using mindfulness to study the organization of experience.
Mm. So, um, some interventions that you've sort of brought up today is in essence to change procedural learning and process information on a bodily level, and not just becoming aware of it, right? Which I think most people think that's what it's all about, but being able to interrupt, right, those somatic narratives so that these patterns that are rooted in the past can be reorganized, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, it's really interesting. You do have to interrupt the working of the engine. You can't just let the client go on with talking, because that I don't think that's where change happens.
Right.
And you do have to interrupt the automaticity of the patterns. Um, but it's not just the body. You can start from any, like a client. If a client comes in and says, I just don't have the support. I never get the support I need.
Mm.
You can start right there with studying the organization of experience. You can say, okay, let's explore that. Like, what happens when you just say that? I don't get the support I need. In a mindful state, and everything slows down like this. Yeah, just say those words inside yourself. What starts to happen in your body? And they'll say, "Oh, I start to collapse. I'm starting to feel sad. I have this image when I was little, and they gave all the attention to my brother or whatever." Now
Mm.
there, you're like zeroing in on formative attachment, memories
Hmm.
that got not only the body not reaching out, not getting support, but also the thoughts and the emotions and the grief and sadness. All that is part of the organization of experience.
Mm. Mm.
So it is working. We do really focus on the body, especially with trauma.
Yeah.
But with with attachment issues, you got to also work with the beliefs that are formed. And like Bowlby would say, the most intense emotions that we have to do with our attachment figures, the formation, the rupture, and the repair of those relationships. So we
Hmm.
have to work with emotions as well
Of course.
as
Right.
the body. Yeah. Am I answering your questions, or
Sorry?
I hope I'm answering your questions.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I would continue asking the same question over and over again otherwise. Uh, so recently, and this was somewhat controversial, but there's a researcher out there. I don't know if you know her. Her name's Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she recently said that the body doesn't actually keep the score, but rather the brain keeps the score, but the body is more like the scorecard. I was just curious to know what your reaction is to that.
I haven't read that about that. She said that. I haven't. I've really been. I've been thinking a lot of Jaak Panksepp, who is a dear friend of mine, and wishing I could talk to him about her theory of constructed emotion. I'd love to hear what he has to say about that,
Mm,
because Jaak discovered the brain circuitry that connected with certain emotions, which he called emotional operating systems across mammals. So I don't know. I think what she's talking about is things are constructed in the brain. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Feldman Barrett's work, but that there are many, many areas of the brain that construct emotion.
mm,
So she might, I mean, she might be right about that. I don't think you can separate the brain from the body.
right.
So I mean, the whole purpose of the brain, as Jaak would say, is to predict the future so you can make an action. So,
Mm,
I mean, it's got to be, it can't just be there's brain and body.
mm,
They're intimately connected. So
yeah.
I don't know what she could mean by that. Uh,
Yeah, I think part of the idea is that it's not that your body is holding on to traumatic memories as much as how it is represented in your brain, and then how that's then expressed throughout your body. So she was trying to, I think, provide a more quote unquote accurate metaphor for it all. Uh,
well, I think it is expressed through the body, but that expression then often feeds back into the brain,
mm,
in my mind. I don't
right.
know
Well,
this.
there's the feedback loop that you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Mm. So let's steer away from this one. But by the way, just for your info, Mark Solms has sort of taken on the mantle of course, neuropsychoanalysis, but is a big proponent of Jaak's work. And there's a discussion between her and Jaak. I mean, her and Solms, where they sort of, you can say, debate these two theories
oh,
of emotion. So,
I don't know Mark Solomon. I
oh,
thought Doug Watts was the person that I knew associated with Jaak and his work. I don't
okay.
know Mark.
Well, Jaak was associated with lots of people, we might say, but lots his work, I mean, influenced so many of
Oh,
us. Um,
oh gosh, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to also emphasize to the audience that your approach, sensorimotor psychotherapy, need not be restricted to trauma. You've already mentioned that also. It's sometimes you use it for attachment, and I'm wondering if you could share other diagnoses that you found somatic work to be immensely beneficial for.
Oh gosh. Well, that's also an interesting question because I don't do diagnoses. I worked in a psychiatric hospital for 5 years in the
Right.
70s, and it was horrifying
Mm.
how people were put into these little boxes as soon as they got their diagnosis. I know it's necessary. I know people have to do it. I never did, and you know I don't want to speak with to diagnoses, but
Okay.
I will say that everybody has a body, and so I think working with the body, no matter the diagnoses, no matter if they're IDD, no matter how young or how old, I think it can be really effective. And our students take this work to psychiatric hospitals and to infants and to IDD and all these different um, domains. I will say that when I worked in the psychiatric hospital, this is one of the main. experiences that got me really interested in the role of the body. I taught yoga and dance,
Mm.
and the yoga classes were very relaxed. Patients could come and go as they wished, and it was, just really slow. And the dance classes back then, you're too young to remember, but there's a lot of line dancing. So I really upbeat line dancing. So I mostly line dancing,
Mm.
which really organized, their bodies to these certain movements, and it was very high energy. And again, they could come and go, and and those patients got better.
Mm.
Maybe they were going to get better anyway, but I think now that I know about Steve's work, I really think that the yoga classes stimulated the dorsal vagal system without the fear, and the dance classes stimulated their sympathetic system without the fear. They could come and go as they pleased, and I think it helped to really recalibrate their nervous systems. And back then, I think a lot of the diagnoses were trauma
Mm-hmm.
based. They were not borderline, and even some of the people diagnosed with schizophrenic and psychotic,
Mm.
I believe it was trauma.
Okay.
A lot of that was trauma based.
Let me ask you this. I've had this on my mind for a little bit of time, but for some reason, and I mean, the idea of body dysmorphia comes to mind, but maybe we can say body image challenges. This has been appearing more in my clinic, and to men and women, or males and females. Maybe because I live in Miami, but in any case, from a brain perspective, I know that there's some ideas that part of the issue is that people who have some body image issues sometimes will focus too much on details. They'll ignore the whole. There's also sort of the visual cortex has some differences, as well as white matter volume, connectivity, and integrity has been changed in ways that would lead to potentially amplifying some of these challenges they face. In any case, I'm curious to know, just from the sensory motor perspective, how you've worked with people with body image issues.
Uh-huh. I think mostly people with body image issues, it gets back to what you first started with introception. They're not feeling from the inside. They don't have a sense of what feels good in the body, what doesn't feel good in the body.
Mm.
Um, so that's usually where we start, where I would start,
Mm.
just on the sense of your body,
Okay.
uh, from the inside out rather than the outside in.
Hmm.
And many of the people that I've worked with are so affected by the culture's point of view of the body.
Yeah.
It's just the culture. I
Hmm.
mean, there have been cultures where uh, uh, big bodies have been lauded, and this was the best that you could in terms of body image, and so that it's really our culture does not do us any favors in terms of our
No,
body.
definitely not. But
No, and that combined with this high paced, go go go, do more, achieve more. You have to leave your body to do that. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with culture personally, and
mhm,
with even as I mean, I think of putting 6-year-olds in at a desk
mhm,
for most of the day. It's just kind of crazy.
mhm, mhm.
Bodies, and even adults, even us, we shouldn't be sitting at a desk even 6 hours a day,
Mhm,
So there's this cultural element that makes us, I think, really disconnect from our bodies. And then you combine that with the body, how your body is supposed to look. Uh, it can really have a devastating impact.
mhm. Okay.
And so, I mean, that's just talking about that too. The impact of culture has been helpful
Mm,
with body dysmorphic clients.
mm.
But I mean, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Every client, there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, it's
And
definitely multifactorial.
some people would say in utero.
Mhm, mhm.
And I think about like different facets, like for African American, or for women, or for men, or for Asian American. I mean, I'm thinking of Du Bois when he wrote, what, in 1904? He said, as a black man, and well, Negro was the term back there, we have to somehow reconcile society's image of us and our own
Mm.
perspective of us. And we all have to do that to some degree. I mean, as a woman, I mean, I'm over 6 feet tall. This is not. I grew up like not feeling okay as a
Mm.
girl and a woman, and so the cultural impact is huge on all of us, and for men too. Like I've worked with lots of men who were not, the typical male desired body, and it's so detrimental. One woman, she was, quite heavy, and she wanted to be thin, and of course we talked about the way that was coming from, because I mean, our culture dictates that we shouldn't be heavy. But I remember working with her, and she couldn't recognize signals of hunger
Mm.
and fullness, and just that became a starting place, like being able to recognize those signals.
Hmm.
You know?
Yeah, that's definitely, I would imagine, quite important, especially
Yeah.
if you're striving for some goal like that. But it's interesting that, does that relate to this rejection of the body to the extent where trying to dissociate from these signals that are so fundamental, right?
Absolutely, it does.
Mm.
Absolutely. I remember reading a book. This was way in the 1970s, but it was called The Continuum Concept, and it just gave this different perspective on attachment. Yeah, I think it was a tribe in Venezuela, and white folks had gone there to, I don't know, missionaries or something, and they built playpens for the children, and well, for this, and as soon as the father put his child in here in the playpen, and the child didn't like it at all, he just chopped up the wood immediately.
Hmm.
There was no question, you know. And
Hmm.
I thought, what a difference to really, allow the children from an early age to express their preferences, and it has a lot to do with the body,
Hmm. Hmm.
the freedom of the body, and so forth. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's also, I think there's something to be had where when children are preferring to let's say engage in roles that are usually assigned to the other sex in some way, those explorations and experiments are ways for them to gain a greater understanding perhaps of themselves as well as the other sex, and how to relate to them better and so forth. That need
Yeah,
not be viewed in a pathological way, right?
no.
Mm.
Well, no, and a lot of that is
Yeah.
is just sociocultural influences. Like
Mm.
I remember my mom was born in 1904. She said to me, you're really smart, but you better not show that.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
it's interesting. But that was in the 50s, and
Hmm.
especially that was, boys should be catered to and allowed to be the authorities and so forth. And
Mm.
yeah. So a lot of that is sociocultural, is what I'm saying, rather than,
Mm.
I think, innate.
Right. I want to steer us. I want to steer us back towards the sensory motor therapy, if that's okay.
But this is all
Specifically,
related.
yeah, no, they're all related. Definitely, definitely. I'm aware of time since I've done a few of these at this point. I don't want to go too far off track. But transference is traditionally understood as something important, right? Transferring of, we could say, pre-existing narratives, emotions, and thoughts onto the therapist, right? Sometimes in preoccupied attachments, there's this idealization of the therapist, or in dismissing a denial of distress symptoms, and in the unresolved, maybe some suspicion or fearfulness. These are some things that people think of, but countertransference and transference are different in your domain of work or in your line of work, because you add another dimension of somatic transference, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can you build on what this means and what that might look like?
Well, one of the ways that I think. And this is why I think it's so important to videotape your work,
Mm,
because I think there's this body to body conversation that's going on all the time. I mean, even between us, the way we move, the way we make eye contact when we look away, and all that it's usually implicit outside of our awareness. But that's a conversation that's going on, kind of beneath the words, that is often the first indicators of somatic transference and countertransference.
mm,
You know, and I mean these are supposed to happen in therapy. It's not like it's wrong or bad. But to see how that happens through the body and to explore it through the body, I think can really be super helpful. Like, for example, I mean, I could give you so many examples of clients. I'm thinking of one client who was like, she was always leaning forward like this and just making this eye contact with me, and really intense. And
mm,
instead of
mm,
just carrying on with that, I said something like, I noticed that this is going on. I wonder if we could explore that. And when she agreed, well, then that sort of brought up that transference where she wanted me to basically save her and rescue her. And it was
mm,
like a child, that cry for help,
mhm,
just so in her body. And so, the body can kind of streamline getting to the somatic
mm.
elements of transference and countertransference.
And when you
Uh,
brought that to her awareness, um, did she stop doing that, or
it wasn't about stopping doing it. It was about it's about exploring. Well, excuse me. And sensorimotor psychotherapy, I mean, the most critical part of the work actually in sensorimotor psychotherapy are these philosophical, spiritual principles that guide everything we do, everything. And one of them is organicity, brought from Gregory Bateson, about every living system has its own intelligence and its own natural unfolding.
mm,
So it was much more about helping her find that inside herself, that the answers she seeks are within her. They're
mm,
not, I mean, I can help her help create the context where she can find those. But to seek them outside is just going to lead to more pain, honestly. And so it wasn't just stopping doing that. It was more like finding a part of herself that she could rest in, that she could trust,
mm.
that she could reach for help when she needed it. But that's different from, the rescue transference,
Right, right.
you know, and that requires a very different way of living in the body. So yeah, she stopped doing it, but not because she inhibited it, because
Mm,
she found something else that was more true to herself.
hmm, hmm. Great distinction. Thank you for making that. I say that because it was partially in jest, because sometimes when you call someone out or you bring something up in a way like that, they become self conscious of it again in the future,
Yeah,
and but
that's true.
but it is a great means of exploration, and that again, that distinction you made was wonderful.
But
Um,
listen, that's a huge difference between sensorimotor psychotherapy and talk therapy, though, because what I want to do is I want my client to get really curious about these habits. It's not like, wow, let's find out about that. This is really interesting. Do you
mhm,
notice how your left shoulder comes up every time you talk about such and such? Isn't that curious? Let's see if we can find out what your body's telling us. So I
mhm,
don't think clients rarely feel like, oh, I better stop it.
mhm,
It's more like the body's tremendous treasure trove of information and insight, and
mhm.
it's such a rich laboratory, and that's what I want my clients
Right.
to try to tune into.
Talking about helping your clients tune into their bodies. Um, Another intervention and of work that you do that's quite different is mindfulness, right?
Mm.
And when it comes to mindfulness, first of all, it's a hot topic in trauma. I was talking to Ruth Lanius. I'm sure you are familiar with her. Um,
All the people you've mentioned except Ian
yeah.
and Yak was going to be on our advisory board, but he died.
Hmm.
So all these people, Bessel, Dan,
Yeah.
Ruth.
Yeah, it
So
was a big part of the interpersonal neurobiology family. But
yeah,
but yeah, so with Ruth, I was talking to her about the danger of mindfulness with trauma victims, and that contents can arise and possibly overwhelm the individual. And I thought your approach in sensorimotor psychotherapy provides a very nice in between, we might call it, sort of incorporating embedded relational mindfulness, right? So instead of
yeah,
doing it alone, it's the therapist is invited to participate in the organicity, in the unfolding of their experience. And I was wondering if you could, yes, you're going to do it anyways, but share some of your thoughts on this and maybe an example of what that
yeah.
looks
Well, it's interesting because I started working with mindfulness and psychotherapy in the 70s,
like.
and it has organizational experience because you can't study the organization experience by conversation, but you can through mindfulness because you've got the observer and then that which is observed, which is the inner contents, your body, your emotions, and so forth. But that's not how mindfulness is usually used in therapy. And I found this out when Dan got interested in mindfulness. We decided to do a workshop. We got almost halfway through that workshop before I realized he teaches his clients meditation. And I never do. I never even talk about mindfulness with my clients. But I'll ask them questions that they have to answer from present moment internal awareness. So
Mm,
it's very relational. I feel like they're taking me by the hand into their inner organization of experience.
mm,
And I do feel like Ruth is totally right. Like a general mindfulness can be really disorganizing for trauma clients, especially those who have dissociative disorders. So in sensorimotor psychotherapy, we use what I call a directed mindfulness. Like you're asking them, it's not just like, oh, what's going on inside. It's like, you know, wow, when you think of, your partner, you take a deep breath. Like, let's notice that breath right now. What's that like? And what does it feel like inside? What happens in your body when you take a deep breath? So it's very directed
mm,
mindfulness. But if you ask a traumatized client, just in general, mindfulness, it can be really disorganizing.
mhm, mm,
And that clients often close their eyes when you ask them a question like what do you sense in your body right now when you think about whatever, and they'll often close their eyes because it cuts off the stimulation, the sensory stimulation, and they can sense better. And people often ask me, well, did you ask clients to close their eyes? And I'm like, no. I said I'm much more likely to ask them to open their eyes.
mm. That's interesting.
Because too much, there can just be too much chaos in there,
Mm,
and they can lose their connection with the here and now.
mm,
So I've often asked clients, how well, I mean, I don't, I ask them, like, is it different if you open your eyes?
mm.
Can you stay present more if you open your eyes? So
You know
it's
what's interesting about what? Sorry, let me just interject a bit here.
oh, go
I just there was a connection I made here also that an additional benefit for keeping the eyes open. So I do Taoist and Zen based meditation, and I run
yeah,
meditation groups, and we also ask them to keep their eyes open. And part
mhm,
of the idea of keeping the eyes open is to help generalize the effects that are experienced through the mindfulness experience so that, because we're not walking around with our eyes closed all the time, right?
yeah, exactly. No,
And
exactly. That's right.
mhm,
That's right. That's right. And just like we don't sit in chairs all the time. So
mhm.
in sensory psychotherapy, we move. We walk. We notice what happens in movement. But it's
So,
interesting that you say that about Taoism because that's a huge basis of Ron's work and my work,
mm,
like from the 70s. You
mm,
know,
mhm.
um, so yeah. I mean, if I that's Taoism is
Yeah,
yeah,
my next book is on Taoism and its intersection with science actually, and our misalignment with nature and such. So
fantastic.
it's been on the top of my mind, but I'm waiting for it to get published. So before I
Oh,
talk
oh,
too much about it.
what's your other book?
My other book is reassembling models of reality. So I think I'll have to share it with you sometime. A big part of it is about the filtration systems within us and the
Oh,
different dimensions of human experience. Causalino suggested it could have been called the structuring of human experience. And so, of course,
uh-huh.
I talk a lot about the body as well as all the way up to socio-cultural experiences.
Oh,
and all
wow.
sorts of things. So
That
uh,
sounds exciting.
yeah, it's a fun book, and it dives a lot into consciousness as well. But
Uh-huh.
but let's focus on you for today. Perhaps we can have another conversation another time about this about my other book. But so I was going back to SM, sensory-motor psychotherapy. Pierre Genet is a huge influence and big massive figure, and you have it's a phase oriented treatment, if I'm correct, right? That with three phases of symptom reduction and stabilization, you start off there, treatments of the traumatic memory, and then you move on to personality integration
Yeah.
um, and rehabilitation. Is this how you typically continue your work?
Well, one thing that I want to say, I've been doing this work since the 70s, and it
Mm,
wasn't until really the late 90s that I got, well, I met Bessel in 1996, and then I started learning all these other things, like about Genet, about, polyvagal theory and all. Um, and these, like the polyvagal theory and Genet's work, have given me a way to explain
mm,
um, uh, the work.
mhm,
But yeah, so now, yeah, I can explain and talk about sensorimotor psychotherapy within the phases of treatment. Um, but in keeping with organicity, whatever phase the client is appropriate for the client is the phase that we're in, and
mm,
it's often even all three phases in one session.
mhm,
You'll start working with the memory, and the client gets destabilized, so you're back to resources, and then it turns relational, and the relationship with the spouse or with you or whatever, and so the phases are very, very fluid.
mhm,
It's not like first you stabilize, then you do memory, and then you do, the rehabilitation.
mhm,
Yeah, and and it's not just trauma memory either. It's these developmental memories that aren't really traumatic, but they're really super impactful.
mm.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. So tracking and body reading, these are sort of, I would say, fundamental skills, right, in somatic
Yeah.
work. When it comes to, well, first of all, I guess some people might not know what they are. Could you maybe share a little bit about what they are?
Yeah, well, tracking is just noticing the moment by moment shifts in the body, like your head just went to the side a little bit, and just noticing this moment. Oh, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but
It's all
it's
right.
these
I'm
tiny
used to
little shifts
it.
that are moment to moment, and we want to teach client how to track their bodies too, like because that'll be a huge asset for them. Like I like working with a client who had explosive rage, and the very first signal of that was a tension in his jaw. So he learned to track that tension because you can interrupt the trajectory if you catch it at the beginning. Once
Mm,
it was full on explosion, it's much harder to interrupt. So the tracking of the body, it's essential in as a therapist because you notice as a client is talking about something, and then you notice their shoulder comes up or there's tension in their legs, and then you can use that information from the body. um, Body reading is, I've just recently been called out on body reading, so
mm,
I haven't found a substitute word because of the implications for slavery and trafficking, um, you know, and people who have that in that either in their current, experience or in their ancestral history. It can be a triggering word. Uh,
Body
very
reading is it?
perfectionistic word. Yeah,
Uh,
like with slaves, they're put on the whatever they call it, and they look at the body, and
I see.
you examine the body, and also I've
Okay.
gotten some pushback on that term,
Hmm.
so we tend to use somatic narrative, but body reading. It's not tracking so much the moment to moment. It's tracking the habits and the postural habits. Like
Mm,
I'm I'm certified in the Rolf method of structural integration. So a client stands and you read their body and you look at where the tension patterns are. You look at, is the head forward? Is the body aligned with gravity and so forth? And then, then in my work, I track how that overall structure shifts in therapy, how the habits shift, how a person who comes to therapy with their head forward, their head starts to move back.
Mm.
And those are very real changes that happen
Mm.
in yeah.
And when you track movements and let's say you move forward with a statement that brings it to their awareness in some way, sometimes you follow up with a somatic experiment of sorts, right? And you provide a slew
Yeah.
of experiments. Could you share maybe a creative or unique experiment that was
Hmm.
memorable for you?
Um, oh gosh, I think of so many,
Yeah.
any experiment is just what happens when, Um, well, I'm going to tell you for the very first experiment that
Yeah, please.
super meaningful for me, but it was with Ron. I met Ron Kurtz in I think '73. He asked me to organize a workshop for him. I did. I had no idea what he did. He did a lot of body reading, and there was a guy was stood up and he was just standing there, but he was going like this.
Hmm. Okay.
And Ron said, "Is your thumb rubbing your finger or your finger rubbing your thumb?" And I thought to myself, what a dumb question. I mean, I was
Sounds like a Zen question, actually.
like,
It sounds like a Zen-like question. That might.
yeah, it is, right? I
Yeah.
was like 20, what was I, 25, 26. I'd never seen anything like this. And that's a mindfulness question. He had to really tune in. And he said, well, my thumb's rubbing my finger. And Ron just went over and he said, well, what happens when I do that for you? What happens when I do that? And the guy just started crying. He just started sobbing.
Hmm.
And because it turned out now, I would think like this is a self-soothing, self-comforting, motion. And Ron just came up and offered that and said,
Hmm.
what happens? And that was it really kind of blew my mind as a young therapist,
Hmm.
like the power of these, even a movement like that, the
Hmm.
power of it. I mean, another experiment could have been, well, what happens when you tune into that? What happens? And he might have said, I don't know what he would have said, but some of the experiments I've done, oh gosh, I think of one with a client. This is a patient who had such trouble with relationship, and he couldn't relate to people at all. He didn't have any friends or anything. So we had this big room and I stood way across the room and I said, well, what happens if you like ask me to come forward, either with a beckoning motion or tell me to come forward and then tell me to stop when you want me to stop. And it was so amazing for him because his belief system was that I was going to hurt him, period, if I came over, if I came closer. So he wanted me as far across the room as I could possibly be,
Hmm.
you know. And so that was one of the first experiments, and experiments, the phrase "what happens when," like that's a mindfulness question. I want to know what happens in your body, what happens in your emotion, what happens in your thoughts, what images come up. And he said, when he beckoned me forward and he got so frightened, got that was and he said, there's this thought in my mind, you're going to hurt me, you're going to hurt me.
Hmm.
And that's transference too. It obviously wasn't me. Yeah.
Hmm.
So the next experiment was a verbal experiment where I said, "What happens, inside in your body and all, if I just say, I'm not going to hurt you." And I mean, I could say that in conversation. Well, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm a safe person. I'm not going to hurt you. But when you slow it down like that and do an experiment in mindfulness, and I said those words, I'm not going to hurt you. And he just, the tears just came.
Mm,
He said he didn't know if he believed me, but he wanted to. And oh, so it's so touching. So
yeah.
that's the power of experiments in mindfulness when you're studying the organization of experience. It's very different from discussion.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you're setting up, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you say what happens when you're giving the frontal lobes kind of a job, okay, you watch what happens. So you're keeping that online
Hmm.
to tell you then what happens in your body and your feelings and your images and so forth.
Hmm.
So experiments are super potent.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And just sort of the idea of holding that belief for so long and it being challenged over and over
Yeah.
eventually allows the person to move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And challenge not by trying to convince him or talk about it, but challenging by having him study his own internal experience when he hears a phrase like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
I want to say, Aldrich, we're getting all kinds of pushback right now. We're also getting a lot of pushback on the word experiments.
Oh.
Because of all the experiments that have been done on Jewish people, on IDD, people with IDD, and other marginalized populations. So
Mm.
I can't think of another appropriate name. So, but I
Yeah.
acknowledge that
Um,
now.
yeah. I mean, nowadays, I mean, words are becoming. We have to be very cautious about words that are being used. Even small t trauma was getting pushed back for a
Yeah.
while, to the extent where this trauma paper I'm working on, I'm calling it covert trauma versus overt trauma.
Oh,
That might
interesting.
be a decent one.
Uh-huh. Oh, interesting. I talk about in the first book I read, I think I talk about covert and overt orienting.
Oh, okay.
It's very related,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, yeah,
So I don't know. We'll see if that works. I still have to describe it a little bit because it's relatively new. But
yeah.
um,
Well, listen, this is the thing. Like in training, some of our trainers say, "Well, just start with a small t little trauma,"
mm,
but you know what? It doesn't matter where you start because you're working with patterns of response,
hmm.
and they're going to show up with huge traumas as well as the
Yeah.
little. So.
I think some the small t trauma folks feel like it's minimizing or diminishing to call them small t trauma when so I don't want to speak for them too much. Um,
Well, it's also the false,
spaces.
I think, the false attribution that trauma's on the outside.
Hmm.
Like if you work with people, I mean, 100 people can have the same thing happen to them and they all have a very different reaction inside. So I never think we're working with the event anyway. We're working with how the effects on that individual.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, so we're running close on time, so I wanted to maybe touch on two or three more questions, uh,
Sure.
and then there's a round of rapid fire that I subject all of my guests to. Nothing crazy, so don't worry about it. So I wanted to touch firstly on oscillation techniques, and how does that relate to these ideas of hypoarousal and hyperarousal and that window of tolerance?
Oh, well, I think for me, oscillation is going from hyper and hypoarousal, dysregulated states
Mm,
to regulated, and like going back and forth. I think Peter calls it pendulating.
mm. So that was
It's
my
really
next question was whether they're connected. Yeah.
like we're connected. I don't use it in the way he does. I don't think, but I haven't I haven't seen Peter work for years, so Um, I don't really know exactly, but the way I think of it is, helping people be able to touch into those states at the edge of the window of tolerance, but to have the agency to go back in to the window so that they're not controlled by the, subcortical dysregulation.
Mm,
And to teach clients that I like let's just touch on it. Let's, and you do that in therapy anyway. I mean, I'm thinking of a client I showed at a webinar yesterday where with this highly dissociative client where, you know, we would touch on something and then we would come back to the relationship and just, yeah, look at me, you're here with me. And we do a little cognitive integration, which is also oscillation, and then come back into the experience of the effects of the trauma.
Okay. With dissociated patients, I mean, derealization, depersonalization, these are, again, I know I'm using diagnostic words there, but people have those experiences, and
Yeah.
and the literature is not very supportive of interventions that are quite effective for them. At least I haven't found much, but I'm wondering from your perspective, how does SM work with? Because I think somatic interventions are probably going to be the best bet for
I think so.
these. Yeah.
But I think there's a big, and I finally started to realize this in the last decade or so. I think there's a big misunderstanding of the relationship between the body and dissociative disorders. Like the complaints that I'll often get from students is, well, all clients will get the somatic resource and it feels great in the session, but they'll come back and they didn't practice it. It didn't really help them. And I think, in my view, that's because there are different postures and different movements that are connected with different parts of the self. So you can't just work with one movement. Like maybe you want to work with proximity seeking because they don't get support, so you're working with this action.
Hmm.
But if they have another part of them that's going, like, don't you remember when you reach out to people, you get hurt? Don't you remember? Don't you remember? They're not going to go home and practice reaching out. So
Hmm.
you have to really help. And this is where my Rolfing training really comes in, because Rolfing training really taught about how different, how the body doesn't fit together in an integrated way.
Hmm.
And that, I think, really connects with dissociation. One part will be afraid of a pushing motion, another part will be, wanting to keep everybody out, and they're not aligned in their goals or their purposes. And it's not just a mind thing; it's a body thing.
Hmm.
So you got to work with the integration of the body and help these parts. Like in this video that I have, there was this part that was really pushing, but there's another part that was really frightened, like a child part. And I said, well, let's let's try this. Like, if you make that pushing motion, can this child part? What happens to the child part? And the child part got more scared because it was like, don't do that, don't do that, So then you've got to like update that system.
Hmm.
And that's, so in that session, she looked at me, the here and now, and can they sense that nothing bad's happening right now? And finally, it shifted. And this child part was like, oh, that other part is just trying to keep me safe. And it was so you have to, and then, but you couldn't just do this. You couldn't just do this movement where
Hmm.
this other part was terrified of it. You had to use the body to bring them together,
Interesting.
right? Yeah. And then at the end, there was a lot of physical self-touch of, like the parts were communicating physically. So that's my perspective. I get frustrated with people who they keep saying, "Oh, well, you have to do a lot of work because before a dissociative patient could work with the body," and I'm like, I don't get that.
Hmm.
You should work with the body right away in that way to help the parts, communicate and discover each other's function.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Yeah. It kind of makes me think about the role of therapist and client, and the idea of how it begins as interactive regulation.
yeah,
There's another Ogden out there, a psychoanalytic Ogden, who talked about the idea that it takes two minds to think through a problem, which was, I think, inspired from Bion's work also. But uh,
uh-huh.
in any case, it's the idea that this interactive regulation eventually can also provide the person with that alignment or integration, so that they can auto-regulate, so that they can regulate themselves without falling apart or.
True.
Mhm.
But it's complicated with dissociative disorders. I think this, what I what I see in students and all is that, yeah, you can provide interactive regulation for one part of the self, but then what about this other part of the self?
Mm.
Like they need a different kind of, regulation. So it's challenging. It is like working with a whole group. Uh, how are you going to regulate all? Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So finally, Pat, last question for you, and I hope this one isn't too mean of a question. It's
Uh-oh.
it's 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 just that there are many somatic-based interventions today, and I was curious to know if you could share a bit about what is it that distinguishes sensorimotor from, for those especially who aren't familiar with your approach, with somatic therapy from Peter Levine or any of the other approaches that are out there.
No, that's not a mean question at all. I think the main thing that distinguishes us is that we have a set of philosophical, spiritual principles very much in alignment with the Tao.
Hmm.
And that guides everything. Organicity is one, nonviolence is another. You don't push the river. You trust the direction the person's going in. You find that thread towards healing,
Hmm.
unity, that we're in it together. We're not. I don't. We're totally in it together. We're co-creating this thing.
Hmm.
Relational alchemy, which speaks to both the therapeutic enactments and the just the uniqueness of the relationship. Mind, body, spirit, holism, presence, and mindfulness, which I really distinguish. Um, 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 and those really guide everything. So, like, if you really rest in those principles, you know, it's just a different kind of therapy.
Hmm.
It's like if you really trust that your client has those answers inside, well, then you're going to help them find those answers. You're not going to be the authority. You're going to help them tune inward in the right kind of way so that enough information can come up from within that they spontaneously reorganize. It doesn't have to do with you,
Hmm.
and that's totally different from a ton of interventions that approaches that I know about. Anyway, I think that's our most distinguishing factor.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and our sensorimotor psychotherapy has been around for a long time, and I think also I work a lot with other leaders in the field, and it's very integrative in that way as
Mhm.
well. Like almost all. I mean, I've taught with everybody you've mentioned, I think, except that Solomon person, Solomon, that I have to look him up.
Yeah, 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 definitely. He's pioneering the whole field of neuropsychoanalysis,
Okay.
and so that's what he's best known for, and a big part of that influence comes from Panksepp. But
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
look into him and
yeah. Interesting. I don't know why I haven't heard of him, but
yeah, yeah, that is, well. There are lots of people out there, but
yeah, yeah.
okay, excellent, Pat. So, are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Uh-oh. The test.
Okay.
Notice how my body changes when you say that.
You're all
And
prepared, ready? Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is kind of the fun part. Lots of people love these. They always comment on them. So, okay. So, first one, we'll start off light on you. Uh,
uh,
this is not light for some people, actually, for lots of people, actually. But name a book that you love.
I love Rumi's The Illuminated Rumi.
Okay. Name a
And
source.
Without a Ching is my second, actually. Well, they're both up there, actually.
I
Yeah.
will have to send you my next book. I think you'd really like it. Organicity is also something that I mentioned in there. That's really interesting. I'll actually look at your principle. Maybe I can derive some more inspiration.
I'll send you a chapter on the principles, although I'd like to rewrite it. But anyway.
Okay. That's always the case when you revisit work that you've written.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Um, so, what did I just say? Name a source of inspiration.
Ron Kurtz.
Okay. What did you want to be when you were a child?
I wanted to be a dancer, but I was too tall.
Okay. Favorite type of music?
Classical piano.
Okay. Any particular composer?
Ah,
Oh, okay. Name something unique about yourself.
um, unique. I play the didgeridoo.
Oh, that's cool. Nice. Uh, we're going heavier now. Do you believe in God?
I believe that something's out there. Absolutely. I feel it. I wouldn't say God in a religious sense
Hmm.
or a man up there in the sky, but absolutely.
Okay.
Mhm.
What is more fundamental to you, matter or consciousness?
Consciousness.
Okay. Is our universe meaningless or meaningful?
Is our universe meaningless or meaningful?
Right.
I think it's meaningful. I think it has to do with expansion, constant expansion.
Okay. Do you have a favorite philosopher?
No,
Okay.
no. But you consider, um, you know, Lao Tzu, a philosopher, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, some people would. Have you read into Merleau-Ponty?
A little bit, yeah. I like Merleau-Ponty. I mean, I'll have a confession. I'm not a huge reader.
Ah, okay.
More of an experiencer.
Yeah,
Um,
it,
I have a huge library. People think I'm this intellectual, but I'm not a huge reader. I like
okay.
experience.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean, it also speaks to the approach, right? When you're helping clients out, you're helping them reach insight that they already have or experiences
that's
that
right.
are within them.
Yep.
Mm.
One of Ron's wonderful sayings, he said, clients are experiences waiting to happen, not problems to be solved.
Mm.
And I just love that.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what is the main purpose of human life for you?
Expansion, I would say.
Okay.
Keep growing, expanding,
Excellent.
consciousness.
All right. That's it. Not
That's
too
it.
bad, right? Not too
That's
bad.
right. At all. Those were like easy.
Okay.
I would love to hear what everybody else said.
Just fast forward to the very end for any of the people on the list, and you'll hear what they have to say.
And is
Some of
this,
them change, though. Some of the questions change depending on what the focus of the interview is on,
oh, yeah.
discussion, right?
Yeah.
But
Those are interesting questions.
excellent. Well, thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate your time and all your.
Yeah,
But
pleasure. I
yeah,
enjoyed it. I feel like we're aligned on so many
hmm,
perspectives.
yeah,
Nice. Yeah.
I think so
Okay.
too. Great. Thank you.
Glad it finally works.